All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at, we're going to try to understand this this brilliant mind, Umar Khayyam.
Okay.
Now, most folks know him as the author of the Rubaiyat,
Right.
like those really introspective and beautiful poems.
Right. Yeah.
But for you, dear listener, who I know is a little bit more philosophically inclined, I wanted to delve into something a little bit lesser known.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Which is his philosophical treatises.
Nice.
So these works, they really give us a direct look at his arguments, his philosophical reasoning. So what we're going to try to do in this deep dive is really understand the core of what he was trying to say.
Right. Yeah.
We're going to do this by looking at his treatises, but also, some of the interpretations by scholars.
Yeah.
And even looking at, how his poetry can maybe shed light on some of his philosophical thought.
Yeah.
So, his poetry offers like these glimpses into his worldview, but the treatises is like this much more direct line.
Totally.
Yeah. To his philosophical reasoning.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to see, you got the poetry and you got the treatises. It's almost like two different modes of thought.
Yeah.
And, we don't always get that,
right.
From thinkers. So it's a really interesting opportunity to see how this incredible mind kind of worked in different ways to approach, these really fundamental questions.
Right. Yeah.
About existence, God.
Yeah.
The nature of reality.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm really excited.
So one of the first things that kind of stood out to me when we were prepping for this was that his work is grounded in the peripatetic tradition.
Yeah.
Which is the Aristotelian school of thought.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is an interesting thing because during his time, philosophy and rationalism weren't widely accepted by the Orthodox Muslim jurists.
Right.
And it's even said that Khayyam had to defend his pursuit of philosophy.
It's true. Yeah.
So, right from the get-go, we see him, actively engaging in this very specific intellectual lineage.
Totally. And I think what's so interesting is that even despite, potential resistance from various different groups or figures in society, he still was drawn to these big questions.
Yeah.
And for him, the core questions of philosophy were three.
Yeah.
Is it?
Is it?
Why is it? What is it? And why is it? Yeah.
So, on the surface, they seem pretty straightforward.
Yeah, they do.
But when you actually start to dig into them, they really have these huge implications.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, his whole philosophical system.
Totally.
Yeah. I mean, he really goes places with these simple questions.
Exactly.
So let's let's jump into some of the big philosophical themes here.
Okay.
And one of the biggest is, the existence of God.
Yeah.
His attributes and the nature of his knowledge.
And Khayyam follows Avicenna, really. Yeah. And he refers to God as the necessary existence.
Yeah.
Or the necessary existence.
Yeah.
So for a philosophical audience, what's the significance of this idea of God as the necessary existent?
Well, within Islamic philosophy, the concept of the necessary existent is it's more than just a theological point.
Okay.
It's really a foundational metaphysical principle.
Right. Okay.
And it's putting forward this being whose essence entails existence.
Right.
So this is a being that doesn't depend on anything else for its being.
Okay.
And so Khayyam, and really building on Avicenna's work, he uses this as a starting point for his cosmology.
Okay.
And he really sort of challenges these purely materialistic explanations of existence.
Right.
And he uses the familiar cosmological, teleological, and ontological arguments to support the existence of this necessary existent.
Right.
Which, as have been debated for centuries in philosophy.
Right. Yeah.
But he brings them in here to really support this idea of the necessary existent.
Right. And he doesn't just stop at arguing for God's existence. He also really digs into the nature of God.
Yeah, that's right.
And the idea of absolute oneness is a big part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he emphasizes God's absolute unity,
right?
And he explores its ramifications for all sorts of other ideas, like unity itself, necessity, causality,
right?
And one of the things he argues for is the impossibility of an infinite regress of causes,
right?
Which is this classic philosophical problem,
right?
But that that ultimately necessitates a first uncaused cause, which is the necessary existent.
Right. Okay.
And what's really interesting from a philosophical standpoint is that he agrees with Avicenna that that God transcends our typical categories of substance and accident.
Okay.
So God's not in motion. God's not bound by time.
Right.
And really importantly, God lacks intentions or goals in the human sense.
Okay.
Right. So to say that God has these things would imply that God has some sort of deficiency or imperfection,
right,
which is just incompatible with the definition of a perfect necessary being.
Right.
So, it really challenges us to think beyond, these really anthropomorphic conceptions of divinity.
Right. Right. So that kind of raises a question for me.
Yeah.
About divine intentions.
Mm-hmm.
So if God doesn't have intentions, like how do we reconcile that with this traditional idea of a creator who brought the universe into being?
Yeah.
Doesn't the act of creation itself kind of imply some kind of intention or purpose?
Well, it's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that philosophers have struggled with, for a really long time. But Khayyam's perspective aligns with this tradition within Islamic philosophy that emphasizes God's being as pure actuality.
Okay.
So God's beyond these limitations of human-like intentionality.
Okay.
Right. So from this point of view, the creation flows necessarily from God's perfect being.
Okay.
Right. It's not from like a conscious decision that's made in time.
Right.
But it's this necessary emanation.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is a really sort of subtle distinction.
Yeah.
But an important one.
Right.
It moves the focus away from a volitional act to a necessary emanation.
Okay.
And we're going to get to emanation, later on.
Right. Yeah.
But it's important to sort of keep that in mind.
Right.
That it's not, necessarily an intention in the way that we think of it.
Right. Right. Okay. So what about God's knowledge then? So he also talks about how a being that's beyond our categories. How does that being understand the world?
Yeah.
So how does that being, understand universals?
Right.
How does that being understand particulars?
Yeah.
And he does go into this.
Right.
Yeah. He discusses God's knowledge of both universals.
Yeah.
Which are these general concepts.
Right.
And particulars, which are the specific details of the world.
Right.
And he makes this really, I think, intriguing point that that God's attributes, when we really deeply consider his essence, are essentially rational considerations.
Okay.
So it's almost like that our understanding of these divine attributes is shaped by our intellect.
Okay.
Right. So it's reflecting these necessary aspects of God's perfect being.
Okay.
In a way that is comprehensible to us.
Okay.
It's like a conceptual mirroring.
Right, where our rational faculties are able to grasp certain truths about God's nature, even if we can't fully comprehend it.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
It's like we can understand some things, but we can't understand everything.
Right. Okay. So let's change gears a little bit here.
Okay.
So Khayyam, he grappled with this with what he called a most complex philosophical problem. Yeah. Which is the hierarchy of existence and the differences in nobility among them.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, for our listeners, how would you explain his approach to this problem?
Well, this is it's getting to this question about the ordering of reality.
Right.
How is reality ordered? What's at the top? What's at the bottom?
Right.
And so Khayyam, at least in some of his works, he adopts this Neoplatonic scheme of emanation. Okay. And you can think of it like this. Yeah, okay. Imagine a light source, and the brightest light is at the top. Right. And that represents, the first cause. Okay. But as that light shines outwards, it gets dimmer and more diffuse. Right. And so you have this hierarchy of intellects and souls that are associated with the celestial spheres. Okay. So it's this framework that attempts to explain the multiplicity of the universe. Right. But while still maintaining that there's this connection to the single ultimate source. Okay. Right. And I think philosophically what's so interesting here is that Khayyam hints at some potential dissatisfaction
Okay.
with fully embracing this.
Right.
Right. So it's almost like he's saying, okay, well, this is a pretty good explanation.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if I'm totally satisfied with it.
Right.
You know, so there's this kind of there's this philosophical tension that he's dealing with trying to reconcile the absolute simplicity of the first cause with this complex hierarchy.
Right. Of the cosmos.
Yeah. So it's almost like he's working within this philosophical framework.
Yeah.
But he's also kind of, stepping back.
Exactly.
And being critical of it.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's move on to another topic, another area that we really wanted to look at, which is eschatology.
Oh.
Or the nature of the afterlife.
Yeah.
And there's this misconception that's really prevalent.
Yeah.
That he believed in the transmigration of the soul.
Right.
So can you clarify, what did he actually believe? What was his stance on this whole idea of the afterlife?
Right. And I think that misconception, comes from certain quatrains that are attributed to him.
Yeah.
But a lot of them, we don't actually know if he actually wrote them.
Right. But his philosophical treatises, when you look at them, they actually show that he believed in life after death.
Okay.
And this is consistent with Islamic doctrine.
Okay.
He discusses this concept of persistence as existence through time.
Okay.
And he actually aligns with Avicenna's view that the rational soul, when it's separated from the body, it reaches this state.
That's right.
That's similar to angels.
Okay.
Right. And this is characterized by this immortal persistence.
Okay.
So it's a much more conventional position,
right,
than the cyclical view that's implied by transmigration.
Right.
This idea that the soul just keeps going.
Yeah, just keeps cycling through.
Round and round and round.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the stuff in the Rubaiyat, the poetic explorations of rebirth, like, we shouldn't interpret those as his definitive philosophical position.
That's right. Yeah.
Like, it's almost like he's using poetic license.
Yeah, absolutely.
To explore different anxieties. Yeah.
I mean, I think the poetry, it frequently engages with these themes of doubt and uncertainty.
Yeah.
And it uses, this imagery of transmigration metaphorically to highlight the transient nature of earthly existence.
Right. Okay.
But from a philosophical standpoint, the treatises are very clear.
Yeah.
In arguing for the soul's continued existence after death.
Right.
In a non-corporeal form.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about another really, another big one.
Yeah.
The problems of evil.
Yes.
Or theodicy. And this is something that's prominent in both his philosophical works and his poetry.
Yeah.
But you pointed out, there's different ways he approaches it in each.
Exactly.
So what can we learn from this?
Well, I think it's a fascinating sort of dichotomy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because in his philosophical writings, he really he makes an effort to try to come up with a rational explanation for the existence of evil within this divinely created and governed universe.
Yeah.
But in his Rubaiyat, he expresses like real dissatisfaction with the presence of evil.
Right.
So it's almost like, he can explain it rationally, but emotionally it's still a problem.
It's still,
Yeah.
It doesn't really sit right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that speaks to, the limitations of purely rational explanations, when we're dealing with suffering and the human need for meaning and solace.
Yeah.
That just, argument alone can't really provide.
Yeah. Okay. So what was, what was his attempt at a philosophical explanation for evil?
Okay.
I mean, we know that he was actually challenged directly on this by Qadi Abu Nasr.
Exactly. And Qadi Abu Nasr posed this really powerful logical dilemma, which is that if God is the necessary existent and the ultimate cause of all being, then how can evil exist without attributing some negative quality or intention to God.
Right.
Right. So it's this classic formulation of the problem of evil.
Yeah.
How can a perfectly good and omnipotent God lack evil?
Right.
So this has resonated in so many different philosophical traditions,
Right.
theological traditions, but it's right here in Khayyam's work as well.
Yeah. Okay. So how did he, the philosopher, how did he respond to that?
So his response is actually pretty sophisticated.
Okay.
And it draws on Aristotle.
Okay.
And Avicenna.
Okay.
And he argues that evil is a concomitant of these contrary relations that necessarily arise between contingent beings.
Right.
So these beings that are themselves created by God.
Right.
Right. And he uses this term necessary, non-essential, predicable.
Okay.
From Aristotle.
Okay.
Via Avicenna.
Okay.
To explain concomitant.
Okay.
So think of it this way.
Okay.
So it's necessary because in a world where you have all these different beings that are interacting,
right.
You're going to have contrary forces,
right,
and there are consequences.
Right.
It's just inevitable.
Okay.
But it's non-essential because God's primary intention was the creation of these beings.
Right.
Right. Not the inherent evil that might arise.
Okay.
And it's predicable because evil is something that we can attribute to certain events or states of affairs.
Okay.
Right. And then he also distinguishes between essential and accidental causation. So God's the essential cause of the existence of contingent beings.
Okay.
But only the accidental cause of the contrary relations.
Right.
And the resulting evil.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, like God's act of creation kind of inherently brings about the possibility of both good and evil.
Yeah.
As like a byproduct of the interaction between created things.
Yeah.
But evil's not God's direct intention.
That's a really concise summary
of
a key part of his argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So he actually also goes further.
He does.
In an appendix to one of his treatises.
Yeah.
He addresses the whole issue of God's foreknowledge of evil.
Right.
And he says that the immense good that results from the essential creation of contingent beings outweighs the accidental evil that arises.
Yeah.
And that to refrain from creation altogether, knowing that evil's a possibility would actually be a greater evil.
Yeah.
Because you'd be depriving the world of the good.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So it's almost like a utilitarian kind of justification.
Yeah. It's really, again, this is kind of a really sort of subtle and complex idea.
Yeah.
But that's essentially what he's saying.
Right. Okay. So let's shift to another another frequently discussed aspect of his thought.
Okay.
Which is determinism.
Yeah.
And free will.
Right. Yeah.
So his poetry often evokes sense of predetermination.
Right. Yeah.
But what does his philosophy tell us about his view of human agency?
Right. Well, I think you're right to point out that the imagery in the Rubaiyat, like the moving finger that's writing our destiny, does suggest a very strong, leaning towards predetermination.
Right. Yeah.
But his philosophical writings paint a much more nuanced picture.
Okay.
Right. So while he acknowledges the force of necessity, wujub,
right,
in the cosmos,
right,
particularly in the context of divine causality.
Yeah.
He doesn't necessarily say that humans are strictly determined.
Right.
And as the scholar Amin Razavi has analyzed, we can actually identify like 3 different levels of determinism in his thought.
Okay.
So you have universal cosmic determinism, which is evident in his poetry, and it suggests this preordained order of the universe.
Okay.
Right. So everything is already set.
Right.
Then you have socioeconomic determinism, which recognizes how our social conditions and our material conditions constrain our choices. Right. So if you're born into poverty, your options are much more limited than if you're born into wealth.
Right.
And then you have ontological determinism, which stems from this Neoplatonic idea of emanation and our place within this divinely ordained hierarchy.
Right.
Right. So we're kind of all we all have our place in this grand scheme of things.
Okay, yeah.
And that to some extent limits our choices.
Right. Okay. So it's not really a simple either.
Not at all.
Like he's seeing multiple layers of influence.
Yeah, I mean, there's this sense that he's really grappling with the tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility.
Right.
So on the one hand, his metaphysics is really emphasizing this necessity that's inherent in existence.
Yeah.
But his ethical considerations, which aren't, super developed in his works, but they're there.
Yeah.
They seem to imply that we have some degree of agency.
Right.
So it's like he's trying to hold these two things in tension.
Yeah.
And I think his discussions on necessitation, on wujub in his treatises on existence, show just how complex this issue was for him. Right. Yeah.
And I think he was dissatisfied with simple answers on either side.
Right.
Just saying like, oh, we're completely determined, or oh, we have complete free will.
Yeah.
He was trying to find, a more nuanced position.
Yeah. Okay, so let's let's get a little bit more technical.
Okay.
And look at his analysis of subjects, predicates, and attributes.
Yeah.
So he really gets into the weeds here.
He does. He gets really detailed here.
Yeah.
And he builds on Aristotle.
Yeah.
Aristotelian logic.
Right.
So, what are some of the things that he says here that are really important for understanding his thought?
Well, he does this, really meticulous categorization of attributes.
Yeah.
And he starts by dividing them into essential and accidental.
Right.
And then for essential attributes, he establishes these 3 criteria.
Okay.
The first is conceptual priority. Right. So the attribute, it has to be part of the very concept of the subject.
Right.
The second is no causal dependence.
Okay.
So the attribute isn't caused by the subject's existence.
Right.
And the third is causal priority.
Okay.
So the subject's nature is in a way prior to other attributes that it might have.
Right.
So for example, animality in the concept of human fits these criteria.
Right.
So that's how he understands essential attributes.
Okay. So then he introduces this other layer of distinction.
He does.
With this concept of considerational